So what kind of man do you think Boaz was before he got married? Well, I think Scripture's pretty clear on this one. He was ruthless. Hello everybody and welcome back to our journey through Scripture. My name is Austin and today we are talking about the Book of Ruth. I'm so excited to be talking about this book because a lot of the books that we've been talking about lately have had really intense themes, some really hard to deal with themes, and finally we get a love story, or maybe even more than one. So the Book of Ruth in the Christian Bible comes right after the Book of Judges and right before the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's placed here in the canon because the first verse of the first chapter of Ruth says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." So you can place this story at basically the same time as the Book of Judges. In terms of when Ruth was actually written, we're not totally sure. It was probably either written, 1, during the time of King David, because Ruth is, spoiler alert, one of King David's ancestors, and people wanted to know about the ancestry of their king, or 2, it was written when the Israelites were coming back from slavery in Babylon and Persia, and people wanted to know about things like intermarriage, and whether or not intermarriage between Israelites and non-Israelites was okay. But let's not get ahead of ourselves with this intermarriage stuff. I have been waiting forever to talk about a book that's short so that we can really get into it. And Ruth is only 4 chapters long, so we actually can do a little bit of investigating. So let's start at the beginning. In the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land, and a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi decided to go from Bethlehem, where they lived, into Moab because they heard there was food there. Now here already, in the first 2 verses, there is so much that you can miss if you don't know about the language and the context. For instance, the name Bethlehem is, as you would expect, Hebrew, and it means house of bread. So the first thing the author of Ruth tells us is that there's no bread in the house of bread, and the people have to go elsewhere. And where do they go? Well, Elimelech and Naomi go to Moab, and we know about Moab and the Moabites from the book of Numbers, because in the book of Numbers we hear that the Moabites would not give the Israelites any food in their journey through the wilderness, so there's kind of this bad blood between the Israelites and the Moabites. In response to that whole feud, we see a law in Deuteronomy 23:3 and 4 that says, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt." So the author of Ruth is already setting up a really interesting reversal here. We've got Elimelech and Naomi going from the house of bread where there is no bread to get food from a people that historically would not give their ancestors food. Beginning the book with a reversal like this tells us that there's probably going to be some more interesting reversals before the story is over. So after a few years, Elimelech dies, and Naomi's 2 sons straight up ignore the rule from Deuteronomy and marry 2 Moabite women named Orpah and Ruth. Now again, if you're reading the Hebrew here, you're not going to be surprised at what happens next. Naomi's 2 sons die. For English readers, this might be a surprise, but for Hebrew readers, they'll go, "Oh yeah, that makes sense because her sons' names are literally sickness and consumption." In fact, several people in this book have names that directly relate to either their character as a person or what happens to them. So Naomi is left alone with her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and she decides to go back to Bethlehem because she's heard that the famine is over. Along the way, she tells both of them that they should return to the house of their mother, which is a really interesting way of saying it because we never hear that in the Bible. We always hear return to the house of your father. Naomi gets really down on herself, and she basically says, "I'm not going to have any more kids, so I won't have any more sons for you to marry, and I can't provide for myself, let alone 2 more women." At first, both Orpah and Ruth say that they won't leave her, but eventually Naomi convinces Orpah, and Orpah turns back. Ruth, though, is not having it. We hear Ruth's response to Naomi's plea in chapters 1:16 through 17. She says, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." Now, everyone recognizes this as a huge declaration of love. We even use it in marriage ceremonies today. Ruth is not satisfied with "till death do us part." She goes beyond that and says, "Not even death will separate me from you, and I will be buried where you are buried." Plus, in verse 14, we're told that Ruth clung to Naomi, and that's kind of an interesting word. In his commentary on Ruth, scholar Todd Linfeld says, "The extravagance of Ruth's solidarity with Naomi is more fully explicated in verse 14 with the use of the word clung. One of the primary contexts of the word is that of love and marriage. It's the same word used in Genesis 2:24, where we are told, 'Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so they become one flesh.' The theme of solidarity and commitment between 2 women, begun here and developed as the story story proceeds, offers a poignant counterpoint to Naomi's inability to measure her self-worth except in relation to men. So obviously, in light of this, we have to make Ruth our Queero of the Week. Now, I'm not going to argue that Ruth was gay because, one, in ancient times, there was no sense of sexuality as part of your identity. And two, we can't erase Boaz from this story, but he's going to come a little bit later. At the same time, you can't erase or ignore love like this. This is huge, and Ruth gives us possibly the most recognizable love song in all of Scripture. But all right, let's get on with the story. Naomi and Ruth get back to Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest, and because they don't have anything to their name, Ruth says she's going to go out in the field to glean. Gleaning is the practice of following behind the reapers in the field, the people who cut the grain, to pick up whatever they leave behind. And it just so happens that Ruth ends up gleaning in the field of a man named Boaz. Now, we know two things about Boaz. First of all, the narrator tells us that he is a close relative of Naomi's dead husband Elimelech. Second, we know Boaz's name means something like pillar of strength or pillar of the community, so we know that he's a powerful and well-respected person. In chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, Boaz says some really interesting things to Ruth. First of all, he tells her that she should stay gleaning in his field and that she should stick close to the young women who are gleaning there. He also says that he's told the young men working in the field that they shouldn't bother her, which is nice. But then he says that she should keep her eyes down and essentially not look at anybody, but that if she's thirsty, she can go to the young men for water. Scholars agree this is a confusing mix of commands. First, she's supposed to stay away from the young men, but then she's okayed in certain contexts. It's possible that what Boaz is trying to do is protect Ruth from sexual harassment in a work context, but still allow her the social space to possibly meet another young man that she could marry. Ruth thanks Boaz profusely, and Boaz even asks her to eat with the official workers in the field, so Ruth gets to eat as much as she wants for the first time in probably a really long time. She even gets to take some of the barley back home to Naomi that night. So Ruth gets home that evening with a ton of barley, and Naomi is psyched. She gets to eat, and then it turns out that this man who gave Ruth all this grain is Boaz, somebody she knows is directly related and might be able to support them in some way. But then Ruth does something strange. She tells Naomi that Boaz said to stick close to the young men in the field, not the young women like Boaz actually said. One explanation for this slip-up is that Ruth, as an outsider, as a Moabite, is not that familiar with the language and just used the wrong word. Another possibility, suggested by Dana Felwell and David Gunn, is that Ruth is intentionally saying this to try to tease Naomi to see if Naomi really cares what's going on. Because the thing is, if Ruth is really out there canoodling with other guys who are not related, that might mean she might eventually marry one of them, which would separate Ruth and Naomi. But Naomi takes the bait, and she does care, and she says, no, don't hang out with those young men, hang out with the young women instead. Chapter 3 is where it all finally goes down. Naomi comes to Ruth in verse 2, and she says, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. All along in the story, Naomi has been worried about financial and family security, and she thinks she's finally figured out a way to get it for Ruth at least, and maybe herself as well. She tells Ruth that Boaz will be working on the threshing floor tonight, a place that is known for partying, by the way, and she tells Ruth that Ruth should bathe and anoint herself and go down to the threshing floor after dark and uncover Boaz's feet. Now, there are a lot of words in this chapter that have sexy double meanings. We see phrases like to lie down, to know, to come to go into, over and over again. But all of those are secondary to this idea of uncovering somebody's feet. We see both feet and legs used as a euphemism for genitals throughout the Old Testament, especially in Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Kings, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, among other books. So anyway, Ruth does what Naomi says. She gets all prepared. She goes to the threshing floor after dark, and Boaz is there, and he's had a bit to drink already, and he's fallen asleep in some barley hay. Ruth sneaks in, uncovers Boaz's feet, and lays down next to him. Now, as we look at the plan thus far, it's possible that what Naomi was trying to do here was to get Ruth into this situation where Boaz might be drunk and wake up in the morning all uncovered and think that he slept with Ruth, and then feel the need to marry her because of that. But what actually happens is that Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night, rolls over, and sees this woman next to him and goes, "Who are you?" In verse 9, Ruth takes charge of the situation, and she says, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." Now here again we've got a double entendre, because cloak can also mean genitals in some contexts. Personally, I think this was Ruth asking for consent, which is awesome. You never see that in the Bible. But some scholars think that Ruth was actually intentionally using a double entendre here when she says, spread your cloak over your servant, because it could mean, let's just have sex this one time, or it could mean spread your cloak over in a marriage context. And so it's possible that Ruth was intentionally making that vague to see which one Boaz would go for. Additionally, by naming Boaz as next of kin, or kinsman redeemer in some translations, Ruth is changing the question. They could have just had sex the one time, or Ruth and Boaz could get married like any two individuals might. But by invoking the right of next of kin, Ruth is intentionally asking Boaz to include both herself and Naomi into Boaz's family. Thankfully, good old pillar of the community Boaz is up for it. They spend the night on the threshing floor together, probably getting it on, and then in the morning Ruth leaves before there's too much light outside and she takes some barley home and shares breakfast with Naomi. The next morning, Boaz gets up and goes to the city gate where all the business transactions take place, and he claims both Ruth and Naomi as members of his family. The rest of the community blesses Boaz and even includes Ruth into the story of Israel by asking that she be blessed like Rachel and Leah, the two women who built up the house of Israel. Ruth and Boaz get married, and they have a little boy named Obed, who Ruth immediately gives to Naomi to basically raise. The end of the Book of Ruth tells us that Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of King David, so we've got our connection between the judges and the kings. So as you can see, there is a lot crammed into the 4 chapters of Ruth, and I didn't even get to get into all of it. I didn't even get to harp on the fact that Deuteronomy 23, that chapter where Moabites are outlawed, is the same chapter where people with changed genitalia are outlawed, and about how bringing Ruth into the community in opposition to those laws gets us King David and eventually Jesus, and what that might say for trans folks. I didn't even get to talk about how Christians say all sex outside of marriage is wrong, and yet here we have sex outside of marriage that brings together 2 of the most important people in the Bible. And I didn't get to talk about the way that Ruth's attachment to both Boaz and Naomi might tell us something about differences between romantic attraction and sexual attraction, or how this story might ring true for bisexual or even polyamorous folks. But that's where we're going to have to stop today because we've run out of time. I hope you've enjoyed this little interlude into a love story. I'm so happy that we got to talk about it. Next week, we're going to try something new. I'm going to talk about both 1st and 2nd Samuel in one video. Originally, Samuel was one book, you see, but they didn't have a scroll long enough to keep it all, so we'll see if I can contain it all in one YouTube video. Until then, thanks to all the Patreon supporters that help make these videos happen, and if you want to get involved, you can help me get all these videos closed captioned for our hard of hearing friends. Special thanks to Valakira and Davida and Lauren and Sebastian, and if you want to get involved, you can go to patreon.com/AustinLionheart, link in the description below. Thanks so much for your support, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you back here next week. Until then, keep reading.